Turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 21. This quarter here in the auditorium, we're studying episodes in the life of David. Our study this morning is entitled David, Jesus, and Joseph Fletcher. Joseph Fletcher was an academic. He was ordained as an Episcopal priest and also a humanist. He signed the Humanist Manifesto II in 1973. 1974, he was named the Humanist of the Year. From 1974 to 1976, he served as the president of what was then known as the American Euthanasia Society. Now, we'll talk more about him as the lesson goes on. But first, let's go to our text, 1 Samuel chapter 21. We'll notice in particular the first 6 verses here. Now, what's happened as 1 Samuel chapter 21 begins is that David has fallen out of favor with King Saul. Remember, we studied from 1 Samuel chapter 17 about David's great victory over Goliath. And that led to the army of Israel defeating the army of the Philistines. David was highly praised. There was a song that came to be sang. Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. So the people in general adored him. Saul readily saw his military ability and put David over the whole army. But that song, David is slaying the 10,000s, while Saul has only killed the thousands. That caused Saul to become angry. That filled Saul with jealousy and envy. And on 2 occasions, Saul tries to kill David directly. Other occasions, he was more circumspect. He decides that he will give one of his daughters to David in marriage. David, you can marry one of my daughters. The stipulation he put that, David protests. David says, I'm poor. I don't have a gift. I don't have anything that I could give you to be your son-in-law. And Saul puts this price on that. He says, if you bring me the foreskins of 100 Philistines, then you can have my daughter, one of my daughters, to be your wife. That was intended by Saul to get David killed. That's why he put that price on that. But David succeeded. David was given one of Saul's daughter in marriage. Saul would send David off in battle, hoping the Philistines would kill him. Time and time again, David was victorious. It becomes evident that Saul only has ill intentions against David. Saul's oldest son, Jonathan, the prince, who would be in line to be king, as much confirmed that. There was a great bond, a great friendship between David and Jonathan. And Jonathan confirms, yes, David, Saul only has ill will and ill intentions towards you. So David becomes a fugitive. He's on the run. Just prior to here to 1 Samuel chapter 21, he has gone to see Samuel. He's, as I said, conferred with Jonathan. And now as 1 Samuel chapter 21 opens, we see him going somewhere else. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse number 1. Then came David to Nob to Elimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said unto him, Why art thou alone and no man with thee? Now Nob was a tiny little village. It was about a mile or two northeast of Jerusalem. It was noted at this point in time as being the village where the priests live. Over in the next chapter, we'll see that there were 85 priests that lived and worked in this village. The tabernacle at this point in time was here in Nob. Not necessarily the Ark of the Covenant, but the tabernacle. The priest Ahimelech comes out and says, David, why are you alone? He's afraid. He would expect if David came to see him, being the son-in-law of the king, that he'd have attendance. Now, there were some men were with David, but they didn't come in at this particular time. So the priest is puzzled. He wonders, why are you alone? And it causes him some fear and consternation. Notice verse number 2. David said unto Ahimelech the priest, The king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, Let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee, and I have appointed the young men to such and such a place. This is a low point in the life of David. We just studied 1 Samuel chapter 17, how he defeats Goliath. That would be a high point. He exhibits great faith and great courage, and because of his actions, he rallies the nation. Remember, they were very afraid, very despondent, very dismayed because of what was going on with Goliath. And he's able to defeat Goliath and lift the spirits of an entire nation. So certainly a tremendous example of faith. David had done something great, a high point in his life. Now here, when he's a fugitive, when he's on the run here in 1 Samuel chapter 21, such is not the case. This is a low point. The priest asked him, Why are you alone? And his answer, he lies. He says, The king has appointed me a business, a task, and I'm on the mission that the king has given to me. The men that are with me, I've sent them to another place, such and such a place. I have them busy doing something, but we're in service to the king. But if you read 1 Samuel between chapter 17 and here chapter 21, there's no such mission, there are no such instructions given by Saul to David. He's a fugitive. He's on the run. And he lies to the priest. He says, The king has given me a task. The king has given me a mission. So whereas as he battles Goliath, we see great faith, great courage, great commitment. Here as a fugitive, we see David not as faithful. We see David sinning. We see David lying to the priest. Verse number 3, David and those that are with him are hungry. So he's going to ask for food. Now therefore, what is under thy hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatsoever there is present. When David asked the priest, what's under thy hand? What do you have? What's available? I need 5 loaves of bread for me and those that are with me. Verse 4, the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread under my hand, but there is holy bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days. When I came out, the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was but a common journey. How much more then today shall their vessels be holy? The priest, Ahimelech, says there's no food here except for what he calls here holy bread. There's no common food, there's no common bread that I can share with you. Now, this bread that the priest is talking about is what we normally think of or normally call showbread, or the bread of presence. Turn with me your Bibles back to Exodus chapter 25. In Exodus 25, the people were instructed to take an offering. The purpose of that offering and gathering together of all these items was to build the tabernacle. Look at verses 8 and 9, Exodus 25. And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show thee, the pattern of the tabernacle, and the pattern of all the furniture thereof, even so shall you make it. I'm going to show you how I want this tabernacle, this tent. It's going to be this place of worship that's going to be where I dwell among you. I'm going to show you how that's to be built. There's a pattern I have. There are specific things to be included in this tabernacle. If you'll go down further in Exodus 25, verses 23 through 30, there are specifications there for a table. It's very ornate. There are very specific things to be included as part of this table. And then look at verse number 30. And thou shalt set upon the table showbread before me always, or presence bread. So this elaborate, ornate, costly table is going to be one of the pieces of furniture in the tabernacle. And on top of that table, you're to put this showbread. Well, what was this bread? Let's go now to Leviticus chapter 24. In Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 through 9, we find the specifications for this presence bread, this showbread. Verse number 5, thou shalt take fine flour and bake 12 cakes thereof. So when the showbread was made, when it was baked, make 12 cakes or 12 loaves. Verse number 6, thou shalt set them in 2 rows, 6 on a row upon the pure table before Jehovah. Now that word row could also be translated pile. But when you make these 12 loaves of bread, you put them in 2 piles on the table, 6 in each pile. It was to be for a memorial. It continues. But look at verse number 9 there in Leviticus 24. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place. For it is most holy unto him of the offerings of Jehovah made by fire for a perpetual statute. Very specific instructions and regulations concerning this bread. How it was to be made, how it was to be presented upon the table. When it was to be replaced the next Sabbath, it was to be eaten by the priest, only the priest, and specifically, it was to be eaten in the holy place. Not taken out, not taken home, but eaten there, only to be eaten by the priest. So when David, here in 1 Samuel chapter 21, comes to the priest, and he asks, "What do you have?" And the only thing there available is his showbread. Now, David has already lied about his purpose for being there. And the priest, understanding that he's the son-in-law of the king, he thinks that he's on a mission that Saul has given him, because that's what David tells him. He seems willing to make an accommodation. He says, we have the showbread here. It's for the priest, but are you and the men with you, are they clean? Now, that's a reference to ceremonial cleanness. Any kind of sexual relations, including between a man and his wife, would make a person ceremonially unclean for that day. So Ahimelech says, I have this bread, but are you and your men, are you clean in a ceremonial sense? And David says, yes, we were clean when we left. It's been a 3 days journey, so we are still clean. 1 Samuel chapter 21 and verse number 6. So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, and that was taken from before Jehovah to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So Ahimelech accommodates. He says, David, you've said you're clean. You said the men with you are clean. I'm going to let you have this showbread. Take it for you and your men. So David, on the run, comes to the priest. He asks for food. He lies about what he's doing. And the priest bends the rules. You know, this showbread is supposed to be only for the priest, but I'm going to let you have some. It shows to us, as I said, a low point in David's life. Even though we remember him as a great, faithful man, he was far from perfect. This is one of numerous occasions where he falls short. And we might take this account and continue reading about David. But there's something very interesting about this passage. Jesus refers to this over in the New Testament. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 12. What we're going to read from the Gospel of Matthew, there's parallel accounts in Mark chapter 2 as well as Luke chapter 6. What's under consideration in these passages in the Gospels has to do with the Sabbath and the way the Pharisees were trying to find something against Jesus. Matthew chapter 12, verse number 1. At that season, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the grain fields, And his disciples were hungry and began to pluck ears and to eat. But the Pharisees, when they saw it, said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath. But he said unto them, Have ye not read what David did when he was hungry, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God, and ate the showbread, which it is not lawful for him to eat, neither for him that were with him, but only for the priest. David and the apostles are traveling on a Sabbath day. As they go on their journey, they come through a grain field. Wheat, barley, it doesn't say. But as they go through this grain field, the disciples start to pluck, to take the grain. Luke tells us that they rub it in their hands to get the edible part, the kernel, the part that would be good for food. They're hungry, they're traveling through, so they take some of the grain, rub it in their hands, and eat it. The Pharisees said, Jesus, why are the apostles doing something that's not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, I understand that the Pharisees aren't accusing the apostles and Jesus of stealing the grain from this field. That's not the part that was against the law. There are provisions for this to be done in the book of Deuteronomy. What the apostles were doing, that would be acceptable. What, according to the Pharisees, was not according to the law was the fact that by taking the grain, by rubbing it in their hands, they were doing something that was not lawful, against the law of Moses. In response, Jesus says, haven't you read, Pharisees? Surely you've read about that occasion. 1 Samuel chapter 21, where David goes into the tabernacle and he eats of the showbread. He did that which was against the law of Moses. He ate food, he ate the bread that was only for the priest. It's about 1,000 years after 1 Samuel chapter 21, what happens to Jesus. Let's go forward now about 2,000 years to the 1960s. Here in the United States, a very turbulent time, I understand, in our nation's history. 1966 was the year Time magazine on their cover, God is dead. They're in black and red. Many common moral principles, many common ways of thinking about things were being challenged. It was in that year, 1966, that the man I mentioned at the beginning of class, Joseph Fletcher, wrote a book. That book was entitled Situation Ethics, The New Morality. As I said, Joseph Fletcher was an ordained Episcopal priest. He was an academic, and he also did a lot of writing. As I mentioned also, he had signed the Human Manifesto, number 2, in 1973. He was a proponent of abortion, infanticide, euthanasia. As I said, he spent some time as the president of the Euthanasia Society of America. In course of time, he really renounced religion and no longer identified as an Episcopalian, but as an atheist. I want to read you something he said to give you some perspective on his mindset. This is from 1968. The article is entitled "The Right to Die," and it appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. The man writing the article interviews Joseph Fletcher. And here's something that Joseph Fletcher said that was recorded in this article. People have no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down's syndrome baby away. Whether it's put away in a sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. I think that gives us some depth and some understanding of this man's mindset. As I said, in 1966, he had written a book, Situation Ethics, the New Morality. And he argues for something different from what he saw. Now, sometimes he's called the founder of situation ethics, but that's not really true. There have then been those before him that had proposed and went along with what he expanded upon. But when you think about morality, when you think about ethics, what's right and what's wrong, on one side you have the idea nothing is wrong. A person can do anything he or she wants. And if you are an atheist, you truly believe there is no God, you truly believe that human beings are the product of evolution, then that's a logical conclusion. There are no rules, there are no absolute moral codes. If you can do it and get away with it, then more power to you. On the other hand, and this is what the Bible teaches, there are moral absolutes. There are some things that are always right, and there are some things that are always wrong. Well, Joseph Fletcher, in his book Situation Ethics, sought to propose maybe what he felt was a middle ground. He said there are no moral absolutes. What is right or wrong depends upon the situation. And he attempts in his book, as he argues for what he would see as a middle ground, he attempts to use Christian principles. He says the principle that should override everything is the principle of love. What a person should do in any instance would depend on what's the most loving thing to do in that particular situation. One writer's pointed out, though, Mr. Grounds, that in his book, Fletcher defines love in as many as 12 different ways. So he's not even consistent in what he would refer to as the principle of love and what love means. In making his case, Fletcher used several real-life examples that would be what we would think of sticky situations as far as morality was concerned. And he used those situations to show that what the person did, even though maybe it was against the law, even though maybe it would be considered generally immoral, for that person in that situation, that particular circumstance, it was the right thing to do because it was motivated by love. Also, Mr. Fletcher tries to go to the Scriptures to bolster his case. Even though he would not really hold to the Bible, he goes to Matthew chapter 12. Those verses we just read, and he says, see, even Jesus endorsed situation ethics. And he recounts what we just read there from Matthew chapter 12. They're walking through the grain field, they take the grain, they rub it in their hands, and they eat it. That was against the law of Moses. David is used as an example by Jesus to defend what they've done. Jesus, in defending his apostles, he says, look what David did. He ate the showbread. That wasn't lawful. They shouldn't have eaten it according to the law of Moses. But David did what was best at the time. Jesus defended David. Jesus endorses situation ethics. Did Jesus really endorse what Joseph Fletcher was proposing? Go back to Matthew chapter 12. Verses 3 and 4. Well, let's look first at what the apostles did there in verse number 1. They took the grain and they ate it. There was no prohibition in the law of Moses for doing that on the Sabbath day. That's the argument that the Pharisees had. You've done this on the Sabbath day by plucking the grain, and by eating it, you've worked. You've violated the Sabbath. But there were very specific instructions in the law of Moses as to what could and could not be done. There's no prohibition against eating this grain. What the apostles had actually done was to violate the traditions of the Pharisees. They weren't guilty of violating the law of Moses. The Pharisees had added a lot of stipulations, a lot of their interpretations to the law, and made that on equal standing with the law of Moses. So understand that it's the traditions of the Pharisees, not the actual law of Moses, that the apostles have violated. Now verses 3 and 4. But he said unto them, have ye not read what David did when he was hungry, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God and ate the showbread, which it is not lawful for him to eat, neither for them that were with him, but only for the priest. Now, what does Jesus say about what David did? Pharisees, haven't you read this? Don't you remember? David ate the showbread, which it was not lawful for them to eat. Jesus isn't defending David. Jesus is pointing out that David did something in violation of the law of Moses. What Jesus is doing here is making what's known as an ad hominem argument against the Pharisees. He's not defending David, but he's using David to point out the inconsistency of the Pharisees. You Pharisees are quick to judge and condemn my disciples, only for eating this grain on the Sabbath day. They haven't violated the law of Moses. They've only gone against your traditions. And yet, don't you remember what David did when he ate that showbread? You hold him up in high esteem. You hold him as a great, faithful king. You look forward to the Son of David, the Messiah, coming. You condemn us for breaking one of your traditions, but you don't condemn David for breaking the law of Moses. That's the argument that Jesus is making. He's not defending David, he's pointing out their inconsistency. You want to quibble and condemn and judge us for eating the grain, but you won't condemn David when he violated the law of Moses. So Mr. Fletcher, in his attempt to use the Scripture, fails as he makes his case for situation ethics. It's sad how many commentaries, both on 1 Samuel chapter 21, as well as these accounts of what we read from Matthew chapter 12, tend to go along with the idea that just as the priest accommodated David and gave him the food when he shouldn't have, and that was okay, it was no big deal. It was no big deal what Jesus did in these gospel accounts. That idea that moral absolutes can be taken away is begun seeping into our society. There was a period of about 20 years or so after Fletcher wrote that book that it was very much discussed, and there were some inroads as far as what we would call organized Christian religion in the United States. There were those that were wanting to go along with that. That sort of faded away. But when you look at our society today, there can be no misunderstanding that we're not as, quote, moral a nation as we once were. There are inroads from so many different sources. As I said, there are some that hold there are no moral rules at all, that you can do anything you want. And it's sad that there are those that try to make accommodations, make compromises and say, well, sometimes you have to do what you think is best. You have to do what love demands. You have to do what's in the best interest of the greater good. All those are reasonings used to set aside moral absolutes. When you go back to the Bible, there are moral absolutes. There are things that are always right, and there are things that are always wrong. It may not be popular in our world today, but that's what the Bible teaches. We have to be careful about those that would go to the Bible to try to justify setting aside things that God's put in place. A little episode in the life of David. We would just read it perhaps and go on, except Jesus used it. And it's significant even in our world today. A very difficult time in David's life. When you go to the Psalms, there are some of the Psalms in which David mentions his enemies and how he's oppressed on every side and how everyone seems to be against him. The situation David was in 1 Samuel chapter 21, that's reflective of when these Psalms would come about. It was indeed a difficult time. But God preserved him, and God indeed, in time, brought him to the throne. Next Sunday morning, we're going to study an event, something David's told after he's become king. But read for next Sunday morning 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7. There we find a covenant that God makes with King David. A covenant that indeed is important for us today. Appreciate you being here for Bible class. We're going to stop now to get ready for our worship hour.